what a day. Oh my goodness. What's that, Lord Dog? The aliens are attacking with cyborg magical zombie alien girls? This sounds like a job for anime! Yeah. Alright, I'm ready.
I'm not sure what to make of that, so we're just gonna move on and let's just pretend we never saw anything happen. I think that's probably the safest course of action here. So I have a whole mess of page. I don't know if you can see this big old page of notes here of doom. I'm gonna try and make this make sense as best as I can because I have a lot to say here, and at the same time I have absolutely nothing to say, which is kind of my point. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let me go ahead and start with this. If you have not seen this series, it is approximately 12 episodes long. I say approximately because there's some people who debate that. Don't ask if you don't know. And 12 episodes, it's good stuff. It also happens to be one of the very, 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 very few animes that I actually recommend. When I say very few, basically I mean two. There are a couple others I can tolerate and have, watched extensively. But really, if you ask me which animes I like, this is among two of them. And no, I'm not going to tell you the other one, although I'm sure someone in the comments will, because it's not like I've been quiet about it before now. And no, I'm not doing a rumination on the other one. I'm not sure how that would even work. But, so obviously I'll be spoiling everything in this one. I'm going to go ahead and say this flat out. If you have not seen this show and have any interest in seeing it, or have been convinced by the fact that I happen to like it, and everything that means, that you should go watch it, is what I'm trying to say. Don't sit here, don't listen to me. I'm going to be spoiling the crap out of everything. But I understand if you don't. I'm going to use a parallel here, real quick. A friend of mine once came to me and had no interest in the Call of Duty series, okay? Zero. And then he asked me why I liked it. So I basically described Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare to him. This was actually pretty recent to when it had come out, just afterwards. So I described that game to him in its entirety, front to back, which of course contained tons of spoilers, and I warned him about that several times. He then decided to go and play it for himself, and enjoyed it. I mention this because the anti-spoilers policy is a choice, not a mandatory. So I'm not saying you have to stop watching this video. Just recommending it if you prefer to have the no-men policy involved here. Now, having said that, now that we've gotten that point forward, I do want to address something really quick. So that's my no spoilers thing, or my recommendation thing. The spoilers gloves are off. You know what I mean. And so I'm going to be discussing all spoilers henceforth. This is your final warning. I'm not even going to put it... Okay, I'll put a quick image up right there. So, now that we've got that out of the way, I want to discuss a little bit why I almost said no to this rumination request. It's not because it's anime. Lord knows my opinions on anime are very commonplace. It's not because it's anime. And it's not necessarily because it's a TV series, although that is a concern as well. In fact, while I did enjoy rewatching the whole series for this, this took a little bit more time than certain other works could or do, and so this had to take the slot of one of the larger scale ruminations rather than the shorter one. For those of you not aware, in order to be able to accomplish something as doing a full game/movie every week, while doing the other 4 features I do every week, I kind of have to stagger that a bit. So I don't do them in the order that you see them, because I literally am physically incapable of that unless I just give up sleeping. That's in addition to streaming. So this had to take a larger slot. In fact, just to throw a little bit of perspective, I am recording this in July. So, give you a little bit of an insight on how this whole process works. Regardless, I really originally wanted to say no, because I didn't feel like I had anything to say about it. Now, under my new rules, I I don't say no because I don't like work. I don't say no because, well, of any reason, really, other than of course, the forbidden list, which is what I like to call the duh list. But anytime I'm asked to talk about something that I really don't feel like I have anything to say about, I just kind of go, huh, okay, I guess. I'm not, I'm not sure. I really don't know what to go into. And that's the problem with this one extensively. And the reason why is because this series, which I'm going to constantly be calling Magica Madoka, because that makes sense in my head for it to be magical Madoka rather than Madoka magical, which makes no sense in my head. But I'm just warning you, I'm going to be saying that wrong constantly. That's your heads up. If that bothers you, I'm sorry. I've been saying it that way ever since I first saw the show, which was over 2 years ago, or 2 years? Yeah, 2 years ago at this point. Anyways, so, Magica Madoka. The show is a deconstruction. The show is designed by its very nature to encourage you to think. The show is pretty overt and obvious about everything. It takes a while to get there, but that's the nature of its construction. It's probably one of the most well-constructed shows I've ever seen, in terms of sheer competency and tightness. I actually can't pick out any plot holes. Even in Babylon 5, I can pull out a few plot holes here or there, even if we ignore individual episodes. But the tight construction and the very, very clear and obvious effort that was put to weave the entire fabric together throughout the course of the 12 episodes is very apparent and very on display, and that means they could be very, very specific with how they approach things, so by the end, all the secrets are revealed and there's not really anything to analyze, because it's all been analyzed for you. The show itself does the analysis. The entire purpose of the show, in many ways, I'm paraphrasing on this point, being, we have this genre of storytelling, primarily in Japan, but it has been presented in other formats elsewhere. The magical girl format. Girl, real-life problems balanced alongside magical problems, having to fight beasts and monsters and dealing with the supernatural while dealing with the normal, that kind of a thing. That is its own thing, but it was the opinion of the people who went into working this that they hadn't really done anything with that genre. It is this series, in short, is the mother. That's going to sound weird. The mother equivalent. If you don't know what I mean, there's a game that came out on the NES called Mother. Some of you might know it a little bit better as Earthbound Zero. The whole point of that game, if you don't understand the parallel, was that the gentleman in charge, I actually can't think of his name right now, forgive me, he looked at games like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy and said, this is an amazing genre, we can do so much more storytelling within the framework of this genre. This is a perfect vehicle for analyzing and discussing and all that fun stuff. Same concept here with Magica Madoka. Puella, Magi, Madoka, Magica, I think is the full title. I have been told that's pronounced incorrectly. To which I say, shrug. Moving on. I'm going to continue to pronounce it Madoka because the English voice acting, which I heard, called her Madoka. Although they say it with a little more of an accent than I do, and I have a really hard time with my A's in general. So. But this is also, in many ways, context the story. That's like the whole series is that. If you don't know what I mean by that, my favorite way to explain this is, well, actually, there's a new way I've had, but I'll use that too. I'll go and do it. Why not? You don't mind me talking, right? I hope. If I say, "Oh, excuse me," you probably know what I mean by that. If I say, "Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me," then there's a slightly different shade to what I'm saying, isn't there? If I say, "Excuse me," then there's a little bit of a different meaning, isn't it? If I say, "Excuse me," again, different meaning. The words I'm saying are not changing, within reason. I'm adding a few little tidbits of syllables here or there, but the actual message on paper remains the same. It is context that changes it, in this case, presentation. So let's say, for example, that, and I'll just go ahead and use my favorite example of context changing the perspective here. Right at the beginning, we see that wonderful sequence of Madoka and Cuba, okay? The incubator. And Cuba is, and oh my god, everything's being destroyed by Walpurgisnacht, and everything's going to hell, more or less literally. And then he's like, all this destruction, all this devastation, you could undo it if you make a contract with me and become a magical girl. At first, and I'll admit I totally had this perspective, and I nearly stopped watching the show. I'll talk about that too, because I know I'm not alone in that one. At first, I'm like, okay, so this is the origin story. This is how she came under these powers, and this is what started it, blah, blah, blah. Later, when we see those scenes actually happen, then we start to realize just how horrific that scene is, because context adds to it. Now we know who and what and why Cuba is. We know why taking that contract is a horrible, terrifying thing. We know the destructive, monstrously bad things that will happen if Madoka in particular takes that contract, and of course the horrible fate that awaits all magical girls. We know all that stuff, and so that context takes the same thing and presents it in a completely different light. The other example I wanted to use was actually from the Age of Ultron trailer. You remember that? Just about a year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. Where he actually starts singing "There Are No Strings on Me." Same song, completely different context. I actually had a whole discussion on this during one of my Halloween streams of how context is how, in my opinion, the best horror is made. Because most things are only truly horrifying when context changes the mundane, the normal, the everyday, the innocent into something terrifying. And that's exactly what we have with Cuba, one of the most terrifying villains ever. So that kind of... yeah. I've heard the comment before that this is a better show to rewatch than to watch. I don't actually fully agree with that. Because the only thing I needed to be told... my friend Charlie introduced me to the series, if anybody's curious. I've mentioned him a few times. He said, very simply, make sure you watch until at least the end of episode 3. And it was a strange thing to be tossed in there, but I said, okay. And I trust Charlie. He and I have very different tastes, but I trust him enough to say that he's not going to, give me something horrible or whatever. It might just be something I'm not into. And, of course, episode 3 ended with the kind of a moment. And then I'm like, all right, you have my interest. And not because it was horrifying or violent or gross or gory or anything of those things, because it was doing something new with it. Just like I originally said. At the time, of course, I didn't know that. But even at the time, I could tell they were trying to expand on the genre, trying to explore the realities of it. Having the obviously hero character, an obviously, experienced, wizened person killed in such a horrific fashion, especially so early on, and given that they did a lot of misdirection to make it seem like Mommy was a main character, which... arguably she kind of is. I mean, that's not even her final appearance in the show. That was impacting. It was, in other words, what I've said many, many times should be done with regards to death in fiction. Make it mean something. Now, I mentioned that, though, and that, you have to watch the episode 3 thing. My sister hasn't seen this show as of me recording this right now. I'm hopeful to convince her to try. If for no other reason than the fact that when I mentioned it to her, her reaction was, well, I'm not into the magical girl kind of genre. And I said, okay, give it a few episodes. But the whole rewatch thing is very much on display. But again, I don't fully agree, because I enjoyed this show the first time. The second time, I did enjoy it more. But that's the effect. That's the Babylon 5 effect. I've called it that many, many times. I'm just going to call it that. It's the Babylon 5 effect. Babylon 5 was an amazing show, but it was a brilliantly, incredibly awesome, my favorite show of all time, the second time through, because now you catch everything. And this is no different. It's the same for just about any work which puts a lot of effort into building up things, establishing things, and was designed as a whole piece before they ever sat down and wrote the first chapter, relatively speaking. Now, I'm going to go and answer something else before we charge forward into a few other things, and that's we're going to talk about rebellion. Let me just go ahead and get this out of the way. No, I don't like rebellion. I actually have I have a separate thing of notes here, no joke, about rebellion, but they're very brief, don't worry, because I'm not talking about them. Originally, the request was to talk about rebellion as well. After some discussion with the person who made this, the patron who made this request, that has been flung out the window, but not just for the obvious reason. Here's the thing. The biggest reason, and I have no problem admitting this, the biggest reason I don't like Rebellion is because I was emotionally invested in the characters. Over the course of those 12 episodes, I actually began to care about these characters and their lives and their situations. I was even sad that Sayaka still ended up dying at the end, to give you an idea of that. So the idea of basically completely taking the possibility of what is effectively a bittersweet yet still happy ending, with Homura finally dying and therefore being with Madoka, they took that and just kind of flung it out the window and went for this twist instead. Apparently not the original intent of the writing, by the way, from what I understand. The director moved for that. I don't know full details. But the point being, first and foremost, I didn't like it because it was crapping on characters I enjoy. You know, the Joss Whedon effect, if you will. Although nowadays that's more the J.R.R. Martin effect. But there's two other reasons, ignoring that, why I don't want to discuss it, and also related to why I don't like it. The first and second most important reason of those, so I guess I'll just say the second most important, let's make that more clear, is because the story is now unfinished. To explain what I mean a little bit more about this, the first 12 episodes ended in a way that completely reset the status quo. So now the possibility of the series continuing, absolutely. But that story ended. That story reached a fairly definitive conclusion. I know some people are going to disagree with me on this, but this is my opinion on the matter. Even though there were a few loose ends and more stories that could be told with the new status quo, and I was even excited for that possibility. In fact, I was fully expecting to see more of the wraiths and how things worked now when I went to see Rebellion, and then it's like, But regardless of that, Rebellion then doesn't conclude. It just stops. And there's all these little threads, all these little plot threads that are still dangling that need to be resolved now. There's all these new changes and differences that need to be worked on. So there needs to be something more. Now, I keep hearing rumors, and I've yet to see anything actually concrete saying, yes, there will be a continuation of the Magica, Madoka, Puella, Magi series. But there needs to be something else. It would be like trying to talk about Empire Strikes Back when Return hadn't come out yet and none of the EU existed. So all of that continuation is just gone. It would be like, to use a slightly different example, trying to talk about, say, Mega Man ZX Advent, aka Mega Man ZX 2. I can talk about that, but not in full because it stopped. And it left threads dangling over this. It stopped in mid-stride. Whoa! Whoa, whoa, whoa. Did you see that? Huh. What is happening? That's the second time that's happened. I think my files are actually getting corrupted. I'm going to have to actually make new ones of these soon. Which is going to suck. Let's just go and switch this to another one. And delete that one. Because I can't afford that right now. I could go to the generic backgrounds, I suppose. The ones I actually purchased. These are ones I recorded myself, as I've mentioned before. Where was I? But that ties in neatly to the final reason why I think Rebellion should not be discussed in this. Because Rebellion was unnecessary. Not because it continued. As I made clear, the series should have continued. But my point is that Rebellion didn't really continue it so much as slam the reset button again. Now, it's not like there wasn't good stuff in Rebellion, because there actually was some really good stuff in Rebellion. Some good character stuff. The battle between Mami and Homura was amazing. You know, there's some really good stuff there, but the flat reality is that at the end of Rebellion, from a storytelling, structural perspective, what it did was it slammed the reset button again. It did the exact same thing that the end of the show did. It didn't explore or expand on the concepts left at the end of the show. It created brand new ones. And that's kind of purposeless. If you're going to keep going through the setting, you don't want to have the very next work hit the reset button again. Otherwise, you just might as well call yourself Star Trek Voyager. Burn. So that's why I'm not discussing Rebellion, for the curious. I'm going to do my best to discuss everything here as best as I can, as I ever do. You should see my notes. The first thing I want to talk about is the setting. we know a couple of things throughout the course of the setting. One of the things that's been mentioned several times, this is relevant, I'll talk why in a moment, is that Kyubey doesn't lie. I will agree with that as a technicality. He does not say the thing that is not true, but he deceives constantly. Lies through omission, lying through a truth, lying by presenting words in a very particular manner. There's this scene where he manipulates Kyoko basically constantly. Like the whole scene, she's trying to wonder if there's any way to save Sayaka, and nothing he says is untrue, but all of it is phrased in a way to be slanted, so that she presumes things that are untrue. And later on, he flat out admits that that's the way that was going. Nevertheless, nothing he actively says is untrue. The reason I mention that is it means that we can establish several things about the setting. For example, the fact that there are other worlds out there with other life on them. Other life that is being consumed or harvested, and other life that probably is also non-sentient or sapient. Why? Well, there's a wonderful scene where Kyubey, I'm having real trouble keeping these names straight, Kyubey, jackass, mentions how he doesn't mind that Earth is destroyed. After all, they've got other... I'm assuming masculine, by the way, to Cuba, so forgive me on that. Anyways, it doesn't mind if Earth is destroyed. It's not really a big deal to him. After all, they've met their quota here, and it's implied that there are other worlds out there as well that they are also harvesting in order to get this energy. So we know that there is extraterrestrial life to some extent or another, and that this setting is more than just the planet Earth, which is the significance there. The next interesting point, which is relevant to that, is the whole entropy thing. He describes it a little inaccurately, actually, although that has been excused in the fact that he's trying to explain fairly complicated physics to 10-year-olds. Or are they 14? I actually don't remember. I know they're teenagers. They're in 9th grade, so they're teenagers. At least Mommy was in 9th grade. She has that whole speech. I'm a 9th grader. So, the whole entropy thing is presented as one of the biggest impetuses for the plot. Now, I understand from a writing perspective wanting to have some reason behind everything. I do that myself constantly. I basically refuse to write a work unless there is some greater meaning or purpose behind it. That's just kind of the way I think and function. The utilization of magical girls and their deconstruction into witches, and then the destruction of the witches and their souls, basically, what we're saying here is they're basically using souls and emotional energy to keep the universe functional. That is a little bit on the outlandish side. I mean, I know this is an anime, and outlandish is one of the more commonly ascribed hallmarks of anime. But really? However, I have no reason to not take him at his word on that. Rather, what I find myself wondering is how exactly they can accomplish that. Well, that leads into the other thing that is true about this setting, karma. Whether you actually think karma exists or not is irrelevant, because in this setting it clearly fundamentally does. There's also some arguing as to whether or not fate exists, but you can't disagree that karma exists within this particular setting. Ergo, the utilization of that karma is one of the things they do commonly. And I'll actually discuss that and get back to that later. So just keep that in the back of your mind. This is probably a good enough time to talk about Kyubey. Now, I've gone on record more than once saying that Kyubey is one of the most evil villains I've ever seen, ever, in all my years of fiction. Not counting real-life villains, of course. And if I was to show you a picture of something along the lines of this, I'm not sure you would actually believe me when I say that. I like the one. That is the villain. And I'm sorry, I'm unbudging on this. I've heard people try to convince me otherwise, saying that, well, no, Kyubey can't be evil because he has no concept of evil. Or he's not evil, he just lacks morality or ethics, and blah, blah, blah. Even the actual creators go out of their way to say that, they don't really consider him quite evil. I absolutely fundamentally disagree. But that is, of course, by my definitions, because he's a bastard. He is also shown to be extremely manipulative, incredibly callous, does not care about things like morals or ethics, actually believes, genuinely believes, that the idea of having emotions and following through on them is a sign of madness. If this was not an alien being, so therefore we are treating it regardless of its alien nature, that would be ascribed to someone who is, at absolute best, a deranged individual who needs to be taken care of for their own sake. Or just an incredibly evil bastard. I also, one of the other things that really bothers me about Cuba is he has a degree of cold calculus taken to its furthest extreme. In other words, we've seen many, many characters, villains, protagonists, neutrals, everything in between, who ascribe to the cold calculus concept. You kill one life to save two. There you go. Boom. There's cold calculus. For anybody who's wondering what I'm talking about and hasn't played Mass Effect 3. It's that may be tactics and that may be logic, but that is not morals. That is not ethics. That's the whole point of calling it cold calculus. It's just completely ignoring any emotions or feelings or thoughts or morality or ethics or whatever when you make the equation. But breaking all of life down to equations and saying that anything otherwise is inconsequential. Cuba takes that to the absolute furthest extreme, being willing to, quite literally, kill all life on planet Earth in order to accomplish something that it believes to be a better end, something that is worth the cost. In other words, Cuba is kind of like most of those characters, even worse actually, that you'll see in fiction where to them lives are numbers. Currency to be expended and utilized towards whatever ends they have. But again, in Cuba's case, he takes it to such an extreme because he is actively, constantly manipulating individuals in order to accomplish those ends. By the way, this leads me to another thing. I've been asked before why Cuba spends so much time in this stupid town, even though it's actually not that long if you pay attention to the timeline. Oh, excuse me. Ugh. The answer is actually pretty obvious. A, it's not that much time. He probably only spends a couple of weeks in any given location in general. But B, and far more importantly, Madoka. He comes here just on a normal mission. I picture personally Cuba just roaming around the earth, doing this every now and again. And he comes here, encounters Madoka, which intrigues him because of how much potential she has. Again, keep that in mind for later. And then the Homura situation occurs, which makes him intrigued because he doesn't know who she is, even though she's clearly a magical girl, and yet magical girls can't come from anyone other than him, And so he sticks around for a little bit more than he otherwise would. I actually imagine that he probably would just show up and just be like, hey, bzz, wish granted, move on to the next, without any real issues or worries. Pretty similar to what happened with Mommy, for example. Oh, you're dying. You want to make a contract with me? Let's talk about Mommy while we're on this subject. Mommy is... Well, actually, let's not talk about her. For the record, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, her name is spelled M-A-M-I, but rather consistently portrayed as Mommy, in terms of the way it's pronounced. I can do pronunciations correctly, I swear. I want to talk about one of the core themes of the work. I know this is a weird place to do it, but I feel this is a better place to do it, and it'll be obvious why in a moment. One of the core themes of this work, and I don't fully agree with this, is the idea that all wishes are selfish. Now, this could be argued back or forth. Some people in real life do not believe that altruism exists, do not believe that selflessness exists. The argument for that usually goes in one of two ways. One, people are inherently selfish beings, so even if you claim or think that you care about other people, you don't, you only care about yourself. I found that to be a very vacuous argument to begin with, and I fundamentally disagree with it. But that leads us to the second argument. Let's say you're a person who enjoys taking care of others. Therefore, your desire to take care of others is selfish, because you're only doing it because you like it. I don't really go for that argument, and it also feels like it's pulling a little bit of it technically. And here's the biggest reason why. I've met very few people who are willing to meet me halfway on this, because I'm willing to meet them halfway if they would agree it is both selfish and selfless. Well, that's actually not true, but I don't want to get into definitions just yet. In other words, if I am benefiting myself because I am helping people, and I'm benefiting other people because I am helping people, the idea of being, both is something that I feel should be a little bit more logical, understandable, something that is real. But this also runs into one of the other problems, which is the definition of the word selfish, aka helping yourself at the expense of someone else, which is how I usually define selfish. Not self-interested, which everyone is to some extent or another. We all have wants, we all have desires. But if you actively hurt or take or ruin other people for the sake of your desires, that would be selfish, by my own definition, which is another reason why we tend to have issues with this. So one of the main points of the work is that there's no such thing as a wish that does not acknowledge, that is not selfish. You're actually asking for something for yourself, even if you try to use it for someone else. And this is a very common, prevalent theme throughout the work. Like I said, I already don't fully agree with that, but I think the real core that can be extracted from that nugget is a little bit more important, being honest. In other words, and I'll be going down the list as I discuss several of the characters, what they wished for and what they actually wanted. But rather than, how do I put this? It is presented as if none of the people, with one exception, actually make a wish truthfully. They wish for something that they think they want, or they wish for something that they think would be a good thing, or they wish for something, for many, many other reasons. But with the one exception, nobody actually wishes for what they actually want. They are not actually honest about it. They are not truthful. They are not open. They don't say, well, I want really awesome M&Ms forever. So instead they wish that M&Ms come out with a new M&M flavor, or they wish for lots of money to be able to support that, or whatever. They don't actually wish for what they want, and the roundabout way, and of course Q-based manipulations, more or less naturally leads towards the despair event horizon, which I'll be talking about a little bit more later. That leads us into Mami. So Mami's wish, she was dying in a car, and she wished not to die. Now, I know that sounds weird, given what I just said about wishing for what you don't want, but that wasn't what she wanted. And that's the interesting thing. What she wanted was to live with the way things had been, with her friends, with her family, not alone. And that ties into how Mami functions. She is very much a zealot character, very strategic, very experienced. Probably my favorite scene for Mami in the whole work is when she finds out the truth about where witches comes from, and just starts wrecking face, is barely stopped from killing all of them, and then committing suicide because of her zealotry and because of her skill. But it is also worth noting that that also partially helps to explain why she died to Charlotte, the witch that killed her. That's also in rebellion. She is also in rebellion. I don't remember her human name. Or is Charlotte her human name? I'm gonna feel real stupid if it is. Anyways, point being that she was so happy, so overjoyed at the thought of having another magical girl, someone else finally to be there with her and to help her keep going and to not be alone anymore, that she was careless when she fought Charlotte. And it shows in the way the actual battle goes, and that's why Charlotte manages to kill her. This also ties into another theme, which I'll be discussing as we go through these characters. I mentioned the context thing earlier. Virtually every character, with one exception, is presented as A and then slowly revealed to be B. Mami is presented as strong, powerful, experienced. She's presented as if she's the hero, the wizened soldier. And yet, as we are revealed, she is actually terrified and alone, and constantly fighting her own fears on those matters. And this ties into her wish and what she actually wanted, to not be alone. This is therefore a good time to segue into Kyoko, who was originally portrayed as an antagonist, and pretty logically. I mean, ignoring the fact that she actively was willing to fight the crew and is literally shot in angles that indicate antagonist villainry style shots. She also is someone who pretty much flat out encourages the other magical girls to completely ignore killing the familiars so that they will kill people so that they can then kill the witch that comes out of the familiar. This whole food chain thing. That's usually pretty horrible of a perspective. Now, so she is portrayed as this selfish, uncaring, kind of a character, and yet as we discover throughout the course of her, she is very kind, very idealistic, and very caring of an individual. It all goes back to her wish, too. Her wish was for everyone just to listen to Daddy, so that everyone would actually, so everything would get better for their family, and yet, based on everything we know, this is a little bit of interpretation, but based on everything we know, it is more likely that what she wished was to stop being in a horrible life, basically. Poor, destitute, living in the cold, that kind of a thing. Speaking as someone who has lived in all of those things, in addition to the final point, and the relevant point for her character, being starving, literally, medically starving, as in not having enough food to survive, it is so logical for a girl of that, especially of her age, to wish for a better life. But of course she didn't wish for what she wanted. She wished for everyone just to listen to Daddy. And that's kind of the catch there, too, as well. That's one of the reasons why Kyoko ties into that whole selfish, selfless thing as well. And she berates Sayaka for that. Because while there is such a thing as wanting for someone else in addition to yourself, Kyoko knows through personal experience how wishing for something for someone else can go badly, since her father, once he learned the truth, committed suicide after killing the rest of the family. It has been theorized that the main reason why she lived through that was because she was a magical girl. A normal human is not going to have a lot of luck killing a lich. Oh yeah, by the way, if you replace magical girl with lich, it's surprisingly 1-to-1. I don't mind that, though. I'm just pointing it out. So Kyoko goes from being, the antagonist to being a stalwart ally, one of the better allies of the group, actually. And in fact, she ends up sacrificing herself for Sayaka. Rebellion confirms there was a strong connection between the two. You can interpret whatever you want out of what that connection's form is, but there's no denying that connection, that caring, that, I'm just going to say it, love was actually there. And it's very understandable given the similarities between what the two girls went through. There's one thing that's interesting about Kyoko, though, that I really wanted to talk about. She doesn't give in to grief. Charlotte, who I have referenced before, wanted to have one last slice of cheesecake with her dying mother. And then her mother died. Based on all the evidence and certain bits and pieces about her, it's actually pretty likely that Charlotte was a magical girl for a matter, and I'm not kidding about this, for minutes before she turned into the witch. Think about that for a moment. It is understandable and logical as to why something like that would happen. You go through a horrific tragedy, you're scarred by it, you become a worse person, right? Not necessarily. One of the things I've always found interesting, and I believe this firmly in real life, although this is belief, not fact, and I like it when fiction does it, when it's actually fact, is the idea that some people will go through hell and come out of it with the worst aspects of their being. They will be deranged, they want revenge, they hate everyone, their life is meaningless, blah, 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 blah. And some people go through hell and come out of it with the best aspects of their humanity, if you will, intact. They now know just how bad things can get. And they want to make sure it doesn't get that bad again, or they want to keep going forward, or they don't want to be beaten, or whatever. Everyone reacts a little bit differently to the same stimuli. And from a writing perspective, that gives you a lot of freedom when writing characters. I actually made a whole point about this when I was doing the interactive Skyrim roleplay, if you guys remember that. I pointed out how our main character, Ellie? Yes. If, she just went through something horrible, and I said the expected thing. Now that she's gone through this horrible thing, she could become darker, more vicious, more violent, and blah, 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 blah. And then I immediately contradicted myself and said, or she could become stronger and more determined and blah, blah, blah. And I pointed out how the exact same stimuli to the exact same character could be interpreted either direction equally. All of this that I'm saying is my theory on why Kyoko never became a witch. Why she never gave in to despair, which is what creates a witch. Because she went through that horrible hell and came out of it stronger than she was before. She put on the mask to hide her true self. And I do firmly believe her idealistic, heroine mindset is the real her. But she put on the mask, walked forward, and said, "Nope, I'm going to keep going." And I wouldn't be surprised, given her age, if one of the motivations there as well was the fact that she always has plenty of food. I know that sounds horrible, but if you think about it, especially from the age perspective, going from starving to having plenty of food all the time, well, I'll go ahead and say from personal experience, it's a hell of a thing. So, that does lead nicely into Sayaka. For the curious, Sayaka is actually my favorite character in this show that I'm not going to try to pronounce again. Sayaka, her wish is probably one of the most deconstructed, and her personality is one of the most deconstructed. Probably my favorite single moment of how we get to see she's presented as this selfless, caring about others, grateful kind of a character, and then underneath she's revealed to be a fairly bitter, resentful, cynical individual. And I think the best moment where that really showcases that is there's a moment where Homura actually saves them, and she shows no gratitude and no thankfulness towards that act. It's a tiny little thing, but there's so many tiny things in this show that are deliberate foreshadowing. I mean, if I actually thought about making a list of all of the symbolism in the whole show, and then I realized that that would be like another 3 hours of me just going down the list. It's everywhere. Now, Sayaka, I'm not going to discuss in summary like I did the other two previous to now, mainly because of the fact that she is probably the best centerpiece character for the show, even though it's a show basically about Madoka, and Homura is arguably the main protagonist. Sayaka is the most examination of the whole process we get. We see her as a person, we see her make the contract, we see the slow descent from making the contract into the realities of what that means. We see her become a witch, and we see the termination of her life. We see the full gamut of Sayaka, the whole cycle of, the magical girl's witch thing of her, and from her perspective in many ways. And that helps to really help hammer home exactly what's happening. She's an excellent tool, for lack of a better term to put it, from a writing perspective, because we get to see everything. So we get to see the nature. We also, through her, see the nature of their powers and how their powers are defined by their wishes. We also get to see the nature of karma as presented in her. But again, kind of saving that discussion for later. This is also when we get to see the whole nature of the wishes being selfish really put on display. Since what she wanted was not for him to get better. What she wanted was for him. Now, several of the things he does seem odd if you look at them with a surface perspective. Like, for example, he gets a miracle. He's miraculously cured. And he just heads home. He leaves to go, oh my God, it's great. That's because, and this is confirmed by the directors and writers and whatnot. I forget the individual in question. Forgive me, I'm terrible with names. But in an interview, he flat out confirmed that there was no special connection in his mind to her, any more than you would have a special connection to a random coworker who you have to try and remember their name every day. You don't rush to that coworker and say, oh my God, something amazing has happened to me. You rush to your friends, your family, the people you do have strong connections with. In other words, this was a very clear example of a one-directional relationship. She wasn't just crushing on him, but considered him very valuable to her. He did not think the same in return. Instead, he was after Hitomi, and the two of them apparently got along well in most of the timelines. I mention this, though, because, again, and it's funny because Kyoko flat out gives this option. If she really wanted him, she should have more directly wished for something like, say, making him more dependent on her, rather than giving him his freedom to do whatever he wanted in the matter. And she probably should have gone ahead and found out if there were any reciprocated feelings before she randomly decides to make a contract with pure evil, I know she didn't know it at the time, in order to accomplish that. Keeping in mind, at this point in time, she already knows there are great dangers involved with being a magical girl. Although the way Cuba manipulates the situation is horrifying. He is such a con artist. He slants things in the worst possible way, and then he shows how things are going to be much, much worse if they don't do something, and they have no right to do anything about it, because they're not magical girls. Oh, and he's going to leave soon, so this is a limited time offer as well. And he's, oh my god, I want to strangle him, and then strangle the body that comes to eat the old body. And just keep doing that for a while until he runs out of bodies. By the way, real quick, I've heard the theory that there is no Cuba race, that they are all, the Borg, basically. I admittedly like that idea. It adds to their alien nature. Just wanted to toss that out really quick. But, so, Sayaka, like I mentioned, is very bitter and very resentful. Now, I'm going to be kind of aping some things that Sci-Fi Debris said here. There's no avoiding it, because we have the same conclusions. I'm not going to just not give my conclusions just because he gave the same conclusions. So here it is. One of the things that could be referenced in this case is the complexity and in-depth nature of gratitude, obligation, and resentment. Okay? I'm going to use his example because it works really well. Prince Charming saves Princess Bobface, I don't know what she's called that, from an evil dragon. Now, she was facing a horrible fate, worse than death. So she is very, very grateful to him. And she rushes off and says, yes, let's be married. They're not related, don't worry. This is not Game of Thrones. And so they get married, and they live happily ever after. Except that's not how it freaking works, is it? That's how a normal story would work. But the nature of this story is deconstruction, analysis. So if the makers of this series had gone and done that story, they would have said, well, okay, what happens a few years later when she realizes she doesn't love him and in fact can't stand being around him, and yet she is now chained to this man who effectively has power over her life. And when she brings this up, he is actually upset about this. Again, the complexity of gratitude, obligation, and resentment. She was undoubtedly very grateful to him for what he did. But he might assume she must be grateful because he did this horrible thing. He might presume that he has the right to her because of what he did for her. She might presume that he has the right to her because of what he did for her. Genders don't matter here. I don't want to get into that. Furthermore, that leads to obligation. She might think she has to show that gratitude in whatever manner. Let's ignore the marriage thing. Let's get it away from something quite so hot-button topic. Let's say this is more like a king. Okay, so the prince rescues, the hero rescues the princess, and the king says, "I will offer you a noble title in gratitude to that," because he's so grateful to the hero. But the hero, who's really good with a sword, turns out to be really, really bad of a lord. Not at the say Joffrey level, but he's nowhere. He's not good, and things are going bad. And so the king points this out and says, maybe we should remove you. And the hero says, "Well, don't you owe me?" Do you see how there's shadings here? And then resentment comes into it. So let's say the king capitulates and says, sure, fine, go ahead and have your thing. I do owe you. You saved my daughter. The fact that you are now under obligation, that gratitude has morphed into obligation, means it can then morph a step further down into resentment. Now the king can't stand the guy. The king has basically completely forgotten all the thankfulness he ever had towards him and just wants him to go away. Can't stand him. You see how complicated that can be? Sayaka shows all of that very clearly and obviously in the entire course of her character arc. Her line is actually probably one of my favorite lines in this entire thing. That's one I remember myself many, many times, and don't ask why. Where she says, "I was stupid, so stupid." She says it perfectly, and that's the moment in which she turns into a witch. By the way, real quick, there's disagreeing reports on what she did to those two gentlemen on the train. Personally, I think she killed them. One of the things that's been mentioned about this work is that it is a dark work. And that's usually been said as a bit of a negative, because usually the term darker and edgier is used as a negative because what people mean is darkier and edgier. Those of you who've seen my show, of course, understand that, as I've made that distinction clear. It is easy to have darker and edgier shift into darkier and edgier. The 90s of comic books in general is a great example of darkier and edgier. But it is still possible to take a work and go darker without going darkier. That is what I think is the case here. This is absolutely, in my opinion, a dark work. Very serious, very stark, and a lot of horror and gravitas behind it. I don't think it strays into dark gear even for a second, though. Especially because of the nature of Sisyphus. I know that's a weird parallel, but bear with me. Sisyphus, for those of you not aware, is from Greek mythology. He did a lot of things, and then ended up in, well, the underworld, having to push a rock up a hill. But no matter how hard he tried, and no matter how far he got, he could never get it all the way to the top, okay? Futility. Okay, you with me? The reason I mention him is because it has actually been debated by scholars and historians for a really, really long time, longer than I've been alive, that he is not a despair story, but he is a hope story. The difference, this is pretty much a quote, word for word quote, the difference between hope and despair is in the mind of Sisyphus. The difference between a tragic victim and a stalwart hero is in the mind of Sisyphus. Now, this seems like a weird direction to go in, but trust me, I'm building up to something here. One of the biggest... There's 4 themes of this work I feel really need to be discussed here. One of them is time. Time is all over the place. The Homera and her abilities, the Clockwork Witch, Valpurgisnacht are all obvious examples of time. But there are a lot of elements of time being woven through the plot, and the fact that time can change things, like I mentioned earlier with regards to Sayaka. The deconstruction is the second theme. I don't really feel the need to deconstruct deconstruction. But the third theme... let's save the third theme for later. The fourth theme is a little bit of a different take on hope. Because the whole point of Sisyphus, and the whole point of this line of thought, is that, I know you're thinking, well, how can you have hope? How can you have a hero who is struggling against all odds? Well, it's actually really easy to explain. Because that's the exact nature of what a hero usually is, isn't it? Someone who is struggling against impossible odds and refuses to give up. Because remember, Sisyphus doesn't stop rolling that boulder up there, does he? He keeps trying. He keeps attempting it over and over, with the idea that someday he might succeed. That is the very nature, the very definition of hope. This show takes a slightly different stance on that. Oh, and the whole hope versus despair thing is the other major theme, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. This work shows hope as not an invalid thing. And yet that hope is not the way it's usually portrayed. Too often in fiction, hope is portrayed as something that comes past and everything's awesome forever. Now, I don't mind that kind of an ending. I don't mind the Return of the Jedi ending. I really don't. But the way this takes it is a slightly more complicated direction, because in here, Homura and all that she does was not in vain. But she does not get the benefits of it. She hoped for something. It came to pass, but it didn't come to pass in a shower of sunshine and rainbows. It came to pass through hardship and work and blood and loss. That's the take this takes on it, that hope is not in vain, that we do not beat the wall, or we do not beat at the air in vain, but rather we do so knowing that eventually good will come of it. Homura, who ironically I have the least to say about as a character, is a very fascinating individual in the way she presents herself as this Sisyphus-style character. Someone who refuses to give up hope. Someone who, according to word of law, and actually this is funny because I kind of thought this as well, has gone through the cycle around 100 times now. By the time we actually see the iteration we're showing. We are shown on camera 5 iterations. But apparently it's more like 100 is the one we're at. But I always thought that, to begin with, that's not really a big surprise. This is someone who has been going through the impossible for a really long time. It's no wonder she is so cold, so distant, so cut off from her own humanity and her own emotions that she comes across as so cold. Of course, her wish is the easiest to discuss. She wished to... The power to save Madoka, and the ability to go back if she screws it up, I think was how she phrased it. I was trying to remember how she phrased it, but again, that wasn't actually what she wanted. Just like in very other cases, she wanted to be with her, to have that life with her. She does not get that in the end. It is worthy of note. She instead gets the task of basically becoming Madoka's avatar in the future, one of the only people who actually remembers her ever having existed to begin with, a sort of retroactive erasement, if you will. And yet, once again, this kind of helps to explain some of her character. Initially, she is portrayed as the bad guy. I have seen people who have watched this who have assumed quite logically that Homura is the bad guy. Because the news, the word that most people are at least aware of this show, right? So they know, well, this is a bit of an analysis, deconstruction kind of a show. So it's logical that portraying a magical girl as a villain would be a way to go in that. Of course, this is slightly more complicated than that. She is portrayed as the villain, but in truth, she is a very meek, very caring, very loving, very emotionally fragile person. Which helps to explain why rebellion happened, too. As much as I disagree with it, I have to admit it is actually in character for Homura to do what she did. She did have the sack, after all. But Homura never gives up. She sacrifices and doesn't get her happy ending, but things are made fundamentally better for basically everyone as a result of her sacrifice. And this is really, really important, all of that death and sacrifice and horror and pain and suffering was not in vain. This is probably, I think, one of the most important things to discuss when it comes to this thing, when it comes to this particular work. Some people think it's cheap that Madoka steps in and basically wins the day instead of Homura, after all Homura's gone through. But that's not true. It all comes back to that karma thing. I have been asked before, and one of the things I was asked specifically to talk about, not by the gentleman who requested this, by someone else, when I mentioned I was doing rumination on this work, was, how does Cuba grant wishes? Because if Cuba has the power to grant wishes, why are they worried about entropy? If they have that level of power, what the hell is the problem? Being the setting builder that I am, I have come up with an answer that I think fits so perfectly that it is my current headcanon. I think that Cuba and his people have a form of either technology or magic, it doesn't matter which, that taps into karma directly. So, if you pay attention, that energy that is released between the magical girls and the witch's death is overall efficient. It is a net positive, because part of that whole cycle is that the karma itself counteracts itself. That's the very nature of what karma means, that sort of balance. The magical girl does good, the witch does evil to undo it. And then they kind of stay ahead of that cycle, thereby creating a perpetual motion machine that can only keep going if it keeps going. So I guess that's actually the opposite of a perpetual motion machine. But it is still greater than 100% efficiency as long as you continue to stay ahead of it. This is probably not making sense because I'm terrible at explaining things. But this also explains exactly everything about Madoka. This is one of those wonderful circumstances, and one of the things I like most about her as a character is that Madoka was not, in my opinion, destined. She was not fated. She was not someone of any significance whatsoever. She was just some other girl that became a magical girl. You know why? You know what her wish was? I keep mentioning how all the wishes but one were not what they were actually wishing for. Madoka is the one exception to that both times. What did she wish for to become a magical girl? To save the life of a cat. Because that's what she wanted. Very simple, very plain, no layers, no depth, but that's kind of the point. She was an innocent, selfless, kind-hearted girl, and arguably the only person who was 100% a good guy, if you can call it in those terms, through the whole work. In fact, she herself comments on how much she dislikes the fact that this whole magical girl thing in reality, her reality, is not good guys and bad guys like she thinks it should be. There's all this muck, there's all this stuff ruining it, there's all this gray. Madoka is the one actual light in the overall gray morass of this entire series. And she was just a plain, simple, ordinary girl, other than that one point, until she became close to someone. Homura. She reached out to Homura. Homura reciprocated. The two cared about each other. Again, clear love between the two. Whether it's romantic or familial or whatever of the points you want to call, it does not matter. The two obviously cared about each other greatly. And then Homura is offered the chance to make a wish in order to save Madoka's life. You understand? Madoka was not significant of her own self. She was made significant by Homura. Homura is the one who goes through the hero's journey. Homura is the one who goes through hell and back, goes through her own personal Groundhog Day for God knows how long that would actually be. I don't have. I guess it's actually probably only like a year or two. About a year or two of time, of constantly going through this cycle, constantly failing, not being willing to give up. She made Magica that significant, and so each time through, we don't know this 100%, and yet it's made pretty clear, and the interviews from the creators make this pretty clear, that each time through, Magica became just a little bit more enticing to Kyubey, to the point where Kyubey absolutely adamantly wanted Magica, even and willing to go through this massive Batman-style gambit of constantly trying to maneuver all the pieces into play on the chessboard just to get to Magica, because she had so much power. And after all, what is Kyubey's power from but karma? And what is karma but balancing of the scales? All this effort, all this work that Homura has been doing has basically been building up more and more and more power. Literal, raw, stopping entropy power around Madoka, and each time she does it, she makes it a little bit stronger. This, I feel, is the biggest reason why Homura could never defeat Valpurgisnacht, because Valpurgisnacht was being made stronger in basically the exact same way. Always at a level just below Magica, because Magica was the focus, but there's that balance thing again, remember? So, I really need to blow my nose. So, no matter what Homura did, Homura may get more experienced, more skilled, and she certainly does. It explains her transition very nicely. But Valpurgisnacht was getting stronger and stronger and stronger each time as karma was slowly building up in the negative sense on, I hesitate to call it her, but because it's more like them, but you get the point. And all of that leads nicely into the way the series concludes. The fact that Kyubey figures this all out and realizes that he can trap Homura within her own unsolvable paradox, basically. Yeah, sure, she could rewind time, but it'll be worse next time. And the time after that. And the time after that. One of the other things, I haven't really talked about Madoka. She has a very simple mindset, very simple character, which I've kind of already discussed, so I don't actually have much else to add to that. But I do want to mention one thing. You ever heard of the cynicism scale? It's like there's cynicism over here, and there's idealism over here, and you sit somewhere on this scale, right? This gradient between the two. We see throughout the course of this that Kyubey is actually the one way over here on the cynicism side, that cold calculus. Madoka is the one way over here on the idealism side. You know, that whole belief that things should be better. Homura's the interesting one to me, because she's pretty much in the middle with pragmatism. More than willing to kill Sayaka, for example, if it means accomplishing her ends, and yet never once actually letting go of the real reason why she's doing all of this. It's an interesting balance point. It's one of the things that makes Homura an interesting character to me. Let me check my notes really quick. I've kind of bounced around a little bit. I think that's actually everything. I've covered all the major points. One of my biggest points that I haven't discussed, I've discussed it in summary, is the idea of what you are in the dark. That's one of the really important themes of this work, and the final theme to be discussed here. I mentioned before that everyone is a little different than they were originally presenting. Homura's the villain, but she's not, you know. Kyoko is the antagonist, but she's not. And Sayaka is the good guy, but she's not, you know, etc., etc. One of the big themes, though, is how these people actually function and act when they have no reason to deny their true nature. And I think that also ties very much into the final character I haven't talked a whole lot about, Kyubey. I know I talked about him earlier. Kyubey acts completely differently based on who he's interacting with. In other words, if you, I'm building up to a point. Give me a moment here. I'm really tired. I haven't eaten today. All of the characters present who they really are after they go through circumstances, sacrifices, hardships, ups, downs, positives and negatives, balancing everything out, karma. Everyone reveals who they really are except Kyubey, who never reveals his true nature or self. Not in the way everyone else does. We don't actually know much about Kyubey the person, only Kyubey the villain. Does that make sense? In other words, he's never alone in the dark. We don't know what he's like when he has no one to lie to, no one to manipulate. Excuse me, I know he's not lying. No one to deceive, no one to manipulate, no one to present himself in a certain way, no one to slant, no one to be a con artist with, right? And I think, and this is my final theory, that that's because there is no Kyubey the person. I don't mean like he's some kind of Borg collective thing, although I tossed that idea out. I don't mean because like he's just a puppet or whatever. What I mean is that he is such a vacuous entity, so alien to how we function, that the idea of there being a real him doesn't exist. That whatever he is always what he needs to be presented as. In other words, he is completely hollow. That there is no core soul, self, or anything of significance underneath his shell, which changes its colors to suit its needs. And I think that's a great way to shine a contrast on all the other characters, who are much more fleshed out, much more real people, and who really show who they really are when really pushed to. I hope you've enjoyed. This has been an excellent work. It was really a treat to go through this series again. Sorry about the background graphic thing. I really need to work on that. But anyways, regardless, I'm going to be seeing you guys next time.